We're happy to have Jeffrey Boutwell with us. So here is a Renaissance man. He's a PhD in political science from MIT. Were you there at the same time as Tom Lehrer, the political satirist, by chance?
That would have been
You
afterwards.
were after.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that
Yeah.
Tom Lehrer, I was introduced when I was 12 years old. Love him.
Although
Um,
I grew up in Boston, so I was well aware of Tom Lehrer when he was at Harvard.
you also worked for the Carter administration, preparing briefing books on foreign and defense policy issues. I might ask you something about that later.
Sure.
Um, you had a 40-year span as journalism, government work, international scientific research. Did you win a Nobel Peace Prize with others at one point?
I certainly did not win a Nobel Peace Prize. I was working in the mid 90s for an organization with a very funny name, the Pugwash Conferences on Science and World Affairs. It's an international organization of physicists who meet to try and find ways of controlling nuclear weapons,
Uh-huh.
possibly eliminating them. But it was founded in the small fishing village of Pugwash, Nova Scotia in 1957, hence the name.
I got you. Well, the most impressive of all I found is that you've seen 38 Shakespeare plays produced on stage, including, I think, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead. Yes?
Mhm.
Well, that's impressive. Uh, Jeffrey's the author or editor of a number of works, mostly dealing with weaponry, from nuclear to trading in light weapons to weapons in space. And he's also written a wide range of articles and opinion pieces as well. His latest work, as Bjorn has shown you, is about his ancestor and namesake, Boutwell, radical Republican and champion of democracy. W. Norton and Company produces it, 354 pages illustrated. As Bjorn said, $39.99, worth every penny and even one more penny. Signed copies are available again. If you're watching, here is the book plate that we'll have. And it's a book taking us from the antebellum era through the Civil War and Reconstruction and even the Gilded Age. Uh, Before we get into that, since you there's something kind of timely that I would like to show because you were there uh, afterwards, actually. But here is Carter. This is a Dewey defeats Truman type
Hmm.
newspaper.
Hmm.
Carter upset by Udall, Milwaukee said. And with this newspaper that I was able to get, I also have a signed photograph of Carter.
Oh, neat.
There's
With it.
his signature holding
Yeah.
up the newspaper just like Truman did
Hmm. Hmm.
back in the day. So tell me, you must have met Carter. What was he like? What sort of a person did you find him? Very briefly.
Modest, self-effacing, but with a keen intelligence. Didn't necessarily suffer fools gladly. If you met with him in the White House or the old executive office building, he wanted you to get to the point. If you were briefing him, I never did. I was a lowly intern. I really have to admit, back in the 70s, I had just come out of graduate school in London, so I was an intern, but I was working for people like Zbigniew Brzezinski and
Mhm.
others on the National Security Council. But Carter was just a fundamentally decent human being with a keen sense of intelligence and a moral compass about what America should be doing in the world.
Well, we miss him, and we'll
Yeah,
miss him more and more, I think, as time goes on. I think his stature will rise above what it has gone down to, unfortunately, but I think
right.
it is rising. Something now a little more personal with you and with George Boutwell as well. I saw that George Boutwell's middle name is Sewell.
Hmm.
Well, I happen to have a little document signed by Samuel Sewell, who was a witchcraft judge. Is there a witchcraft judge in your past?
I will have to look that up. Sewell is a very common name in New England. It goes back to the Puritans, and it's one of the kind of established family names in New England. George has the name Sewell because his father's first name was Sewell.
Oh,
That was spelled with an E, not an A.
Yeah.
I don't know if they were actually part of the Sewell family, but it's a good, I mean, especially with the connection to the Salem witch trials, I'll have to look that up.
Yeah, it'll be fun to find out. He actually recanted later in life. He was
Mhm.
unhappy with what he had done.
Yeah.
Um, Someone that we were talked about briefly before we even came on air is that even though we don't have a copy of his book, The Negro in the Civil War, Benjamin Quarles, who's I've had his book many times. It's a wonderful book, but it's interesting how Benjamin Quarles, the author, influenced you. Give
Mhm.
us a brief reason why.
Be glad to. First of all, let me make a disclaimer. George is not my ancestor. People in the genealogical
Ah,
field are very strict about this, and they tell me I cannot refer to George as an ancestor because I'm not a direct descendant. George Boutwell
hmm.
had no direct descendants. He had two children, a son and a daughter. Neither one of them had children, so that when they died, the line stopped with them. What we do have is a common ancestor, James Boutwell, who emigrated to the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1632, as a common ancestor for me and George. James fathered farming families that spread out through New England, and I'm in one of those farming family lines. George Boutwell is in the other. So George is a family relative, but not an ancestor. On Benjamin Quarles, I love talking about this because it's one of the most wonderful discoveries I made during the research and writing of the book. And I do have to say, I didn't make it. My wife, Bethana, made it.
Hmm.
But while I'm working on the book, she stumbles across on the internet the fact that Benjamin Arthur Quarles, the distinguished African American historian who wrote for decades, he taught at Morgan State University in Baltimore, and especially was the concept of Black agency. That Blacks
Mhm.
had much to do with effecting their own emancipation, their own progress in American life and society. They were not just passive bystanders who were given emancipation by Lincoln or anyone. They really did work to effect it themselves. So
He
Quarles,
was very early on in that. He was much earlier because
oh, he's one of
now
the
it's said everywhere, but he was early before this.
Oh, Quarles is one of the originators of that concept back
Yeah.
in the 1930s. But the story is that in 1933, Benjamin Quarles is a new graduate student at the University of Wisconsin, and he wants to work on Black agency, and he tells his white thesis advisors that he wants to pick a Black subject to write about. And they tell him, no, you can't do that. We don't write about Black subjects here in our history department at University of Wisconsin for two main reasons. One, there's a paucity of information on them. You won't be able to find anything out about them, no primary source materials or anything. And two, we wonder if Blacks writing about other Blacks can truly be objective. Well, how absolutely horrific a statement is that, and how condescending. Anyway, Quarles was prevented, at least for his master's thesis, in writing about a Black subject. So he said, okay, I got to find someone else. What he did was write about George Boutwell. His master's thesis is entitled George Sewell Boutwell, a Radical with Reasons. And he talks about Boutwell as being one of the foremost radical Republicans during Reconstruction who stood up for the rights of Black Americans, and especially stood up for the two key elements of Black agency, in Qualls's view: one, public education; two, the right to vote. That Blacks needed both of those to become full citizens of the United States. Well, when my wife Bethana comes in one night saying, "You'll never guess what I found on the internet, a master's thesis from University of Wisconsin almost 100 years ago, written about George Boutwell," I was just thrilled. I tracked it down. I got a copy from Wisconsin. I then got some copies of correspondence between David Blight and Benjamin Quarles when Blight was first at Wisconsin in the 1980s,
Huh.
beginning his research on Frederick Douglass.
Nice.
Anyway, it was just a wonderful story that all started with a thesis found on the internet.
You never know where it's going to start, but
Yeah.
things come up. Um, just again, just very briefly, what resources did you have for George Boutwell? What letters or diaries exist? Well, where were you most productive in your research?
Mhm. This was one of the fortunate things of working on George. When I started in March of 2020, at the start of the pandemic, my thought was, okay, I've known about this guy for a while. I know a little bit about him. I really should find out more. Maybe I'll write a long essay for the family, just 60 pages or something to get it down on paper. Well, how I lucked out was that not only, of course, today you can get so much information on the internet, the Library of Congress, and elsewhere, but George Boutwell lived in the town of Groton, Mass, just a little bit west of Concord, Mass, for 70 years. The Governor Boutwell House still exists in Groton, and that's where all of his papers are. Now, almost no one has ever looked at them. There was a modest biography written in the 1980s about George that was published by the Groton Historical Society, but that plus the Quarles thesis are essentially the two only academic, treatments of Boutwell ever written. So I went up to Groton, got in touch with them. I was familiar with the town. I'd been there before, and even lived there for a little bit. But with the help of their archivist and librarian, when I say archivist, it's a part-time, 2-day-a-week person. There are banker's boxes in the closet up there that just have loads of George Boutwell correspondence and newspaper articles and this and that. And so there's a lot of primary research material at the house.
How lucky. That's
Yeah,
great.
very lucky.
We're going to show artifacts as we always do as the show progresses. And one of the things we'll show here or there might be a cartoon or two that is in your book.
Mhm.
So Boutwell appeared in cartoons. He was well enough known, and we'll show why soon, that cartoonists used him. How did he react to those that were not very flattering to him?
Um, Good question, and I'll say I don't know. I've never seen him, comment on that in his letters
Hmm.
or anything else. Certainly, I have seen his reaction to all of the criticism that the Grant administration was getting for corruption, nepotism, from 1869 to 1877. And of course, George was Grant's Secretary of the Treasury, so he was in the bullseye for that criticism as well, especially from people like Henry Adams,
Hmm.
who couldn't stomach either Grant or Boutwell. But Boutwell took exception to the criticism that Grant was getting, which of course also deflected onto him.
I'm not sure who anyone in the Adams family enjoyed liked. So
Oh,
he's in good company, I'm sure. And now he was involved. George was involved in many facets of American life. He was a farmer, governor, congressman, senator, cabinet member. So maybe give us. I want to talk about these individually as we go along too. But so everyone, our viewers know a quick bullet point of his achievements. What were his accomplishments that would come in bullet points in an obituary, perhaps?
sure. I'll start with by actually referring to a cartoon, since we were talking about cartoons. When I was researching the book, I came across, most people or some of the viewers will remember Ripley's Believe It or Not, the cartoons that used to
Sure.
appear in newspapers. Well, George Boutwell appears in a Ripley's Believe It or Not. And I've got a copy from the 1970s, and it has to do with he being Lincoln's Commissioner of Internal Revenue.
He was the
And the
first.
cartoon is here's George Boutwell, Lincoln's Commissioner of Revenue. When he started work in July of 1862, he had 3 assistants. That was it. That was the extent of the Revenue Bureau.
Hmm.
9 months later, when he left in March 1863, there were over 3,000 employees in the Revenue Department of the Department of the Treasury.
They might
Certainly,
be trying to get it back down to three right now.
well, I would tell people that I was related to the person who introduced the income tax in America in 1862. And then I would say, please don't hold that against me. You
Did
know,
you know Sheldon Cohen?
yep.
He was a good friend of us, and Ralph knew when he began our shop, and he was a collector as well, but he was with the Internal Revenue.
Yeah. Um, but George, that was one of his big accomplishments. In the space of 9 months, he oversaw the mammoth growth in the Revenue Department, which of course was crucial for generating funds for the Union Army in the Civil War. The introduction, as I said, of the first income tax. I will mention it was a progressive income tax, a graduated income tax, which George, as a good, progressive, very much wanted, not a flat tax. Uh,
Hmm.
but he really, it was a Herculean effort. He talks about working evenings and Sabbaths, for 9 straight months to get the Revenue Department up and running.
Well, it was the middle of wartime. They all did that, it seemed.
Yeah.
Um, well, there were two achievements that I noticed in your book that are fairly large. One is he was involved with the 14th and 15th Amendments, and another that he was in the Senate in 1875 on a Senate committee investigating violence against blacks in Mississippi. He went down there bravely
Mhm.
enough to
Yeah.
investigate that. From his point of view, and the Internal Revenue being a third, which of those three achievements do you think, from his point of view, he'd be most proud?
Oh, no question, the 14th Amendment to the Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
George was on the Joint Committee on Reconstruction and the House Judiciary Committee in 1866 as the 14th Amendment was being prepared. He helped write them, both the Civil Rights Bill and the companion 14th Amendment. They finally decided just to go for the 14th Amendment, which was ratified. George Boutwell was always most proud of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment and the concept of instituting national protections for individual liberties and voting rights from both the 14th and 15th Amendments for all Americans, not just recently freed blacks, but all Americans who, of course, were then citizens because of the birthright citizenship component of the 14th Amendment as well. That was his crowning achievement.
What was he on women and their vote?
On the wrong side. And it's interesting because he had a daughter, Georgiana, Georgie for short, who was his constant companion in Washington for most of the decades that he lived there. George's wife was somewhat of an invalid, so his daughter Georgie accompanied him to Washington, would go to social functions with him, would stand with Mrs. Grant, Julia Grant, at receptions at the White House. And Georgie was a modern woman for the time. She was one of the first people to sit on boards of Massachusetts, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, for various functions. George had old-fashioned views when it came to women. He said the man is the head of the household.
Mm-hmm.
Ergo, the woman does not get taxed, but by the same token, the women should not get the vote. It was only late in life, in his 80s, that he finally came around and agreed with his daughter that it was time for women's suffrage.
You spoke about his writing of the 14th Amendment. How was he both in writing and speechifying? What was his style of giving speeches? Was he persuasive as an orator, and about his letters and something like the 14th Amendment? But how did he write? Did he write well?
Um, Depends what he was writing.
Mhm.
George, he was a master craftsman at writing and at facilitating compromise positions in kind of group sessions. That started with the Massachusetts Constitutional Convention in 1854. It continued at the 1860 National Republican Convention when he was one of 7 members of the Platform Drafting Committee. So George was often called upon to, find compromise wording for important documents, and that continued with the 14th and 15th Amendments. When it came to speechifying, I wish I could be as complimentary. One of the famous or one of the favorite adjectives or descriptions of George was he was like a steady wind blowing aft. Uh, when he got up in the floor of the House or the floor of the Senate, he would go on too long. He would talk past the sale. He would, just reiterate the same point time and time again. And that really actually hurt him a lot during the impeachment trial of Andrew Johnson in April
Mm.
of 1868, when there was a famous story that we can get to later.
All right, well, you will. Just want to ask also his background, his religious views. Was he religious, or was politics his civil religion?
Just like Lincoln, politics was his secular religion.
Yeah.
Uh, he he went to church. His mother was religious. She would read him the Bible. He went to church more out of form than out of conviction. There were famous stories of he and Charles Sumner when they both lived in Washington. Sumner was not much of a churchgoer either, and George would walk over to Sumner's house on Sundays and they would spend the day talking rather than going to church.
Uh, the Now, what was his character like? You have called him a true Yankee, and I think also yourself for that matter. How do you
Mhm.
define that term? What was his character?
Modest, Um, Not aggrandizing or wanting to put on airs or show off. He was not an extrovert, not a showman. He concentrated on getting the job done.
Hmm.
Whether it was working with his dad on the farm or in the dry goods store that he started as a teenager and then as a lawyer. George kept his mind on his business, and he was just a ferocious, attention to detail kind of guy, which is why he was often called upon to, run the Revenue Department, to run the Treasury Department, to craft the 14th Amendment, uh, which is one of the reasons I think he was neglected compared to people, especially like Charles Sumner, Ben Butler, or Thaddeus Stevens, all of whom were larger than life characters, were constantly in the news, and George was very much in the background and to
Hmm.
a large extent happy to stay there.
You also call him an Emersonian man. Explain that, please.
Actually, that's Megan Marshall's quote
Oh, it
for
was. I
her
saw it and
her
I made
recommendation
it
of
on
the
you. Well, is she
recommendation
correct?
of the book.
Is she correct?
Um, yes, Emersonian self-made man.
Uh-huh.
George never graduated from high school. He was self-taught, very much like Lincoln. He studied with lawyers in Groton, Mass. When he was in his late teens, and that's how he learned the law. He never went to law school. So he really, used the tools at the time, working with lawyers, going to lyceum events, reading until 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and splashing his face with cold water if he started to fall asleep. He was very much a self-educated, self-disciplined Emersonian man.
Well, his first public office, I believe, was in the local post office and under McKinley. Now, he helped McKinley. He was on McKinley's campaigns. Uh, you said he's a radical, right, in the book, in the cover. And how radical, I guess I would ask, was he? For instance, here is a piece of political Americana for McKinley. And at the bottom of it is written very small that this will prevent the barn. If you put this on your barn, this will prevent the barn burners from taking it down.
Hmm.
And barn burners were one of the radical bands. And of course, what they were talking about is that they would rather take down the barn than compromise and
Hmm.
temper it. So, what do you think? Was he a barn burner or a
Yeah.
different type of radical?
And we're talking about Martin Van Buren in the late
Van
1830s.
Buren, yes.
Yeah,
Did I
and
I say
that's
something else?
McKinley.
Oh gosh, no.
Yeah.
Van
Um,
Buren.
and George met him in 1839. It was the first president he ever met. George, a little bit of background. He started off actually in the Temperance Party in the 1830s. His family was very much teetotalers. It was obvious very quickly that being a temperance candidate was not going to get you any votes and not get you elected, so he became a Democrat
Hmm.
because he had come from a modest farming family and he was very much interested in farmer and labor issues. But of course, in the 1850s, when the Democrats were, favoring and were in favor of slavery, George said, that's enough for me. And he helped found the Republican Party in 1854, 55, 56. He was radical only in the sense that, Thaddeus Stevens was radical or part of the clique of radical Republicans in the 1860s, who were also known, of course, as Black Republicans. He was
Hmm.
called radical because they all favored, first emancipation and then some modicum of civil equality and political equality for blacks. That was the meaning of the term radical.
Would he have agreed with Barry Goldwater? Extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice.
Um, George was he had enough passion for what he did that at times he might have agreed with that. And the best example of that, of course, is the campaign he waged against Andrew Johnson. Uh, Much of the negative opinion of George and the other members of the impeachment committee, of course, over the years is they went much too far in impeaching Andrew Johnson, that they were trying to illegally remove a sitting president from office. George would have said, it's not at all. Johnson is trying to illegally restore white governments in the South. He has committed acts of malfeasance in the presidency. He's blocked the will of Congress. He's refused to spend congressional funds for the Freedmen's Bureau. He has illegally removed military officers from the South who were protecting black rights. And George would have said nothing is too extreme in the pursuit of impeaching Andrew Johnson.
You have a political cartoon in your photo in your book. There's a photograph of the committee, him on it, and then you also have this political cartoon, uh, the impeachment manager. Now he had to give up the chair of that committee, but tell us about that cartoon. What did that do for Boutwell? How was he presented?
Yeah, it's one of my favorite cartoons. And as you said, yes, George Boutwell originally was going to be the chair of the impeachment committee, but Ben Butler threw such a hissy fit,
Hmm.
uh, especially when it was then when George was going to be the original chair. He deferred to John Bingham of Ohio, who was recognized as, the constitutional scholar on the committee. He deferred to John Bingham as chair, at which point Ben Butler threw a hissy fit and said, "I'm not serving under, John Bingham." And at that point, George said, "Okay, well, I'll, step in and try and meld these two uh, differences together." So he stepped aside finally and convinced Butler to support Bingham as the chair of the committee. I like this cartoon especially because, one, it's just a great pictorial representation of Ben Butler as Falstaff. You could imagine Thaddeus Stevens there in the middle as a Richard III with a crooked back and a malevolent stare. George Boutwell I call the Cassius of that impeachment committee. And of course, the line from Shakespeare is that Cassius has that lean and hungry look.
Yeah.
We don't trust that man. And it's very true. George was just so dead set against Andrew Johnson getting away with what he thought was a traducing of the Constitution that he was the Cassius of the impeachment committee.
How did George treat his opponents? How do you deal with political opponents? Strident? Any conciliation? What was he like?
He was very good at conciliating colleagues within the Republican Party. And there are a couple of good examples. One I said between Ben Butler and John Bingham. Later in life, between Roscoe Conkling and James Blaine, when those
Mhm.
two were going at it in the 1880s as to who was going to be nominated for president, George managed to keep good relations with both. But the best example is his relations with Charles Sumner and Ulysses Grant. Because, of course, in the early 1870s, Grant and Sumner had just a total falling out, hated each other. Sumner did everything he could to undermine Grant's foreign policy. But George kept on friendly terms with both of them and tried to conciliate their viewpoints. In the end, not very successfully. Sumner supported Horace Greeley for president in 1872, but George was good at trying to conciliate opposing viewpoints within the Republican Party. As far as the Democrats go, in the campaigns of 1868 and 72, he was just vicious. He would go on the campaign stump in North Carolina, from North Carolina to Maine for Ulysses Grant, and just rail against the white Democrats who were trying to restore Confederate control in the South, constantly waving the bloody shirt.
Last week, as you know, because you were watching, you told us, we had Alan Taylor on,
Mhm.
and a continental view of the Civil War in Mexico, Canada. But you pointed out, you emailed me afterward, that he made 2 points that are kind of central to what George Boutwell believed and fought for. One was the conflict between the Southern concept of confederation of state and states' rights
Mhm.
versus the unified national country based on majority rule that the North believed on, and also liberalism based on equality of rights. Uh, if you want to expand a little bit on that, please do.
Sure. And this goes back to the 14th Amendment being George's crowning achievement. At the end of his life, He was very adamant in writing that putting too much power in the hands of the states was a fundamental flaw of the Constitution. And that's precisely what the 14th Amendment was designed to correct, that there would be national protections for individual liberties and voting rights that would apply to all Americans, no matter which state in which they happen to reside. And George was clear on that, that we're all Americans, we have American citizenship. You may be a resident of a different state, but your citizenship of that state doesn't even come close to what your citizenship as an American is and the rights and protections that you should have because of that.
Well, he must have not felt very good about people like Robert E. Lee, who took an oath to defend the country and then didn't. What sort of an abolitionist was he? You know, the Western abolitionists out here were a little more flexible with working with non-abolitionists, you know, like Lincoln, but whose heart was in the right spot, like Ichabod Cotting here in central Illinois, who helped Lincoln as an abolitionist. The Eastern abolitionists tended to follow strong leaders like Garrison and Phillips, who were more absolute in their feelings. What sort of stripe of abolitionist was George Boutwell? Some called him a trimmer.
Trimmer actually is an appropriate term to describe George Boutwell, but only back in the 1840s and early 1850s.
Okay.
It is true when he was governor of Massachusetts from 1851 to 53, he came in for a lot of criticism from Wendell Phillips and others in not being foursquare in favor of abolition. George's response to that was, look, I'm the governor of Massachusetts. I have to obey the law. And the Fugitive Slave Act of the early 1850s is something that I have to obey. I cannot, not obey a federal law. And so other, Phillips and Garrison and whatnot called him a trimmer. By the time you get to the late 1850s, and George is, helped found the Republican Party, he's going to the National Convention in 1860. He is foursquare on the issue that slavery is the cause of the impending crisis. When war came, slavery is the cause, emancipation is the solution, and he was absolutely adamant about that long before many other people were. He gave a speech in Charlestown, Mass. In January of 1861, just after Lincoln was elected, in which he said, we cannot retreat on this. The South can do what it wants, but slavery, will not be permitted to expand into the territories. It has to be put on the road to extinction as the only way to save the Union.
So the treatment of slavery after the war, he was a practical type, as you say in here, worried how they would be treated after freedom. And he pushed a policy called pact gerrymandering to increase their political power. Explain that policy to us, please.
Shortly after, or even before the war ended, and it was clear that blacks were going to be emancipated, what are we going to do with them? Where are they going to go? How should the federal government, help to protect them? And George did come up with a concept of setting aside confiscated Confederate lands in the coastal areas of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, giving that land to blacks to farm, to make a living, to become economically independent and viable, much like what David Hunter and other Union generals were doing during the war. So that he was in support of that. He supported the Freedmen's Bureau at the end of the war in, providing both education and economic wherewithal to blacks. And he made the point, which I thought was kind of far-seeing at the time, was that it's going to be important when blacks get the franchise that they be able to maximize their vote. And if they can do that best by being congregated in certain areas and not being spread out across the South. Otherwise, they'll fall prey to white majorities or, white manipulation. So he really kind of was in favor of pact gerrymandering, and kind of like what folks talk about today in terms of a reverse migration to the South, of increasing the potency of the black vote in the South.
Was not very successful.
No, no. Well, of
Yeah.
course, the Freedmen's Bureau was totally undercut by Johnson, and who returned a lot of the confiscated lands to their Confederate owners, and very quickly, and which, of course, was one of the reasons that George then led the impeachment campaign against Johnson.
Now, as Secretary of the Treasury later under Grant, I think there's a wonderful cartoon in your book uh, showing him uh, and Grant being his puppet.
Hmm.
Was Grant his puppet when he was in Treasury?
It's a wonderful, funny cartoon. George is the uh, hurly-gurly, hurdy-gurdy man, doing the winding it up, and Grant is doing his bidding by taking money off the shelves of the Treasury. I mean, this is part of the whole rehabilitation of Grant's reputation as president. Uh, George had a great deal of latitude in running the Treasury Department, in setting fiscal policy, in retiring the debt from the Civil War, in engaging in regular, transparent sales of gold to bring down that debt. And Grant essentially delegated authority, much the way he had during the Civil War, to his generals. Hamilton Fish as Secretary of State and George as Secretary of the Treasury, I think were Grant's two prominent lieutenant generals, or in his administration. But Grant did suffer from inattention to what was going on around him, and that got him in trouble. But was he
No.
Boutwell's puppet? No, not at all. That was
Okay, so
pure
that was not a
Democratic
fair
fancy.
that was not a
Yeah,
fair cartoon then.
no. It was
Um,
it was an opposition cartoon in the New York
sure.
Herald. Yeah.
One of your footnotes, and I'm an inveterate reader of those things, you mention that the Treasury Department had one of the highest numbers of patronage positions available. What did Boutwell think of patronage? Did he use it?
He did. He was a loyal Republican
Mhm.
who thought that when Grant was elected, that positions should go to Republicans if qualified candidates were found. He was not in favor. He was very meticulous about, looking at the qualifications of the people he hired. He didn't just hire no-shows and incompetent people, but given a choice, he would hire, those in the Republican Party. And this, of course, was before the Civil Service Commission came into effect in the 1880s. But, to the victor go the spoils. Yep.
Yep. What was his relationship with his predecessor, Salmon P. Chase? Uh,
Uh,
where what was that relationship
yeah.
during the war and afterward?
Hmm. Um,
Did Chase snipe at him at all?
It started off very well. Chase and Boutwell got to know each other in the late 1850s when Chase is governor of Ohio and a staunch abolitionist, and the two of them are talking about bloody Kansas and the Lecompton Constitution and all that. It was Chase who really ensured that Boutwell got the position of Internal Revenue Commissioner. Lincoln was thinking of hiring a Pennsylvanian uh, by the name of Lewis, who had written a campaign biography of him, and even was talking to Governor Curtin of Pennsylvania shortly before George was hired. But Salmon Chase, said, convinced Lincoln to hire George. From there, the relationship certainly went downhill. George could be a bit opinionated, is a kind word about his colleagues. He thought Chase was phlegmatic. One of his famous quotes from his memoirs is, "Given enough time, and thought Chase might come to the right conclusion." Uh, so by the time that Chase leaves Treasury and becomes Supreme Court Justice, the Chief Justice, they have a kind of a cool relationship. And then, of course, that really exploded when the currency decision on the part of the Supreme Court, when Chase, ruled that greenbacks were invalid.
Um, he was, well, let me ask you this. I was going to say that he was involved in three emotional national moments, really. I'm sure more, but three of them really
Mhm.
came to mind for me. One was the Lincoln assassination itself. Uh, And as Boutwell says, you quote, he who destroyed slavery was himself by slavery slain.
Hmm.
So, what was Boutwell's relationship to Lincoln? Did they meet or write letters much back and forth during the formation of the Republican Party, during the campaign as president? What happened?
Hmm. Um, Brief summary,
Yeah.
George first met Lincoln right after the convention in 1860 when a delegation went to Springfield to notify Lincoln of his nomination. He then, of course, becomes revenue commissioner. He also got to know Lincoln when George was a part of the Virginia Peace Convention in
Mhm.
February of 1861, that last-ditch effort by Virginia to try and stave off civil war. Lincoln arrives incognito in Washington, goes to the Willard Hotel. He and George and other delegates meet that night. The long and short of it is that they were never, I think, close personally, but they certainly were of a like mind on emancipation and doing what was necessary to win the Civil War. And given that George was working in the Treasury Department as the Commissioner of Revenue, he would often stop by the Executive Mansion on his way to the War Department and the Telegraph Office. So he and Lincoln met on a fairly regular basis, impromptu, talk about appointments of revenue commissioners, but more importantly, to talk about emancipation and Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation in September of 1862.
In 1886, there was the third. We talked about the impeachment, and that was something that we've already gone into. But the he was in the funeral procession as a pallbearer, along with Simon Bolivar Buckner and others.
Hmm.
Um, and I've handled a couple of times a very thick book of the grand procession, the funeral procession through New York. It was made for hotel lobbies, especially, and put
Hmm.
up there. But in 1886, soon after this, a book came out that actually showed uh, the the procession photograph by photograph.
Yeah.
And this is a little different than the one in your book. I can't see how this looks, but there it is. We can show the one that's in your book. And he was a pallbearer for Grant. And he sat with Logan, John Logan, correct, in that
Yep.
procession?
And if, there are two columns of carriages there, the column on the bottom, the second one from the front is the one that George is sitting in with Logan.
Yes. And they were good friends, of course, at that point, too.
Yeah. I mean,
Um,
I do want to say a quick thing about Grant because that was the other wonderful, wonderful discovery in writing the book. Um, George and Ulysses Grant got to know each other and like each other very much, and their friendship extended not just between themselves but to their families as well. George's daughter, Georgiana, became a good friend of Ulysses Grant. She visited him in New York on East 60th Street when he was dying of cancer. The Boutwells and the Grants got to know each other quite well and had continuing correspondence even after Ulysses died in 1885 between Georgie and George and Julia Dent Grant and the Grant children.
well, they were so close that George lent Ulysses a suit of clothes, right? What a great story that is when Grant waded into a stream.
Okay, you've got me on that one. I do
There
not know
was
that
that
story.
he gave him a dry suit of Grant in, in I was going back in the footnote to the 15th chapter. There's a story in there that you relate about Boutwell lending Grant a dry suit after Grant had ridden into a fast moving stream and couldn't get out for a while. And he was superstitious, Grant, enough to get in there to do it. He thought you cross the stream, but it didn't work too well, and he came out dripping wet.
Hmm.
Boutwell lent him a suit of clothes.
I'm going to have to modify.
I don't have exactly where you got that
Yeah,
from, but it's in the footnote, 15th
yeah.
chapter.
Okay. I'm going to have to modify that a little bit, Daniel. I think the story is it's the famous story of Grant riding his horse when he's courting Julia at Whitehaven in Missouri, and
Mm-hmm.
has to cross a rapidly flowing stream. He gets totally wet. He doesn't want to turn back. And of course, that's part of where the famous Grant, I never turn back. I will never turn back. I'll just press forward. That's what he did through the stream when he's going to
That's that
court Julia
superstition.
Dent. And it's
Yeah.
her brother or a family member who
Oh,
gave suit of clothes to
it
Ulysses.
wasn't George. I read that
No,
wrong. I'm sorry. I thought it was a good story.
it's a great story. I wish it
I'll
was
ex-
true, but
I'll excise it out of here. That's all we can do. I
yeah.
want to get into something that was really very much on George's mind, and that's American imperialism.
Hmm.
And you talk near the end of the Great White Fleet that McKinley sent out, and with George Dewey. In fact, I've had a number of these wonderful souvenirs that
Mm-hmm.
came back with these are feathers and
Yeah.
silk and a glass eye. And this is a very small one. Most of them are pretty large. I have one on the wall right now. These were the souvenirs that they came back with from Korea and Japan and China. Um, in the movie Lincoln, they had one of those on the wall in the cabinet room as if it was Victorian patriotism, but it wasn't. It was 1907, for heaven's
Yeah.
sakes. But nonetheless, they had it there. But that shows the imperialism of America. How would you define American imperialism? It's not the same as straight colonialism where you take over
No.
and it's your property. What was it like? And still maybe.
I'll try and answer that the way George would have answered it, and that is that when he became president of the Anti-Imperialist League in 1898 to protest McKinley's and then Teddy Roosevelt's annexation of the Philippines, the military occupation of the Philippines, imperialism for George would have been uh, the misuse of military power abroad,
Mhm.
use of military power to project American influence rather than using American political and economic power. He felt the same way about the Kingdom of Hawaii. In the 1880s, George was hired by the Kingdom of Hawaii to act as their counsel in Congress on some sugar reciprocity treaties and whatnot. But George was always dead set against the Americans annexing Hawaii, which they did finally in the 1890s. He thought we can get everything we want through trade, through political, diplomatic relations, even things like, use of the Pearl Harbor base in Hawaii without necessarily physically annexing a foreign country or territory or militarily occupying them. To him, that was what imperialism was and why he was so dead set against it.
Do you agree with all of what he felt? Do you have modifications that you would think of?
I think he was pretty prescient when it came to the Philippines, especially. America got involved in a jungle war in the Philippines, and what, 5 or 6 thousand American soldiers died, 200,000 Filipinos died, and all this is 60 years before we got involved in another misadventure in Southeast Asia. Uh, yes, I think he was correct in terms of misuse of military power. Uh,
Bjorn, you're here, so there must be something. I do have a few more questions that I'd like to get to, but
Sure.
what do we have?
Sure. Well, I want to take a few minutes here to I have at least one question to share, but I also want to acknowledge some of the folks that are watching, and I'm viewing the stream, and this is a very popular interview. We have a lot of eyes watching this interview right now, and so congratulations, Jeffrey. People want to
thank
hear
you.
about this book. Um, but I want to send a shout out to some of our friends that watch regularly. Bill Donahue from Danville is watching. Mary Cavell from Chicago is here. Tom Pete from Port Angeles, Washington. Dan Matson from Denver, and our friend David from Gurney is watching again. We also have a couple of shout outs and comments. Mary Cavell says, "Hi, Jeffrey." She loves the book.
Hi, Mary.
James Lazar, love hearing this. She got her book last week. So some greetings for you, Jeffrey, some of your friends.
Good.
Also, I have a question. We have a question from John Sampson, and John wants Jeffrey to comment on what prompted Boutwell to resign his cabinet position and take Henry Wilson's Senate. seat.
Senate seat.
Thank you, John, for doing that. And I'm going to bow out while you answer that
Okay.
question, Jeffrey.
And that must be John from St. Louis, who is the coordinator of our U.S. Grant Association book club, which is great fun. George was primarily a legislator at heart. He loved the cut and thrust of legislative politics, of consensus building, of writing the amendments, writing legislation. He was a wonderful administrator, as shown by the IRS, the Revenue Service he did in the early 1860s. But of course, he only did that for 9 months before he left that to become a congressman for 6 years. And he felt the same way in 1873, that he knew a Senate seat was coming up open because of Henry Wilson's death, and he wanted to get back into the U.S. Congress.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for the question. It was good to go over. I wanted to ask you about the era of government failure that he lived through. And chapter 4, of course, is entitled America's Troubled Rebirth, and which sounds very Irish, the Troubles. What about American troubles? Tell us about that and Boutwell's reaction to it.
And you're talking primarily about Reconstruction and the failure
Yes.
of Reconstruction, and then the rise of Jim Crow in the
Exactly.
1880s and 90s. It was just a supreme disappointment. And I don't want to make too many parallels with what's going on today, but certainly one of the major impediments George saw to the success of Reconstruction was the U.S. Supreme Court in the 1870s and 80s and 90s, that they gutted the 14th Amendment, they gutted national protections for individual liberties, for voting rights and whatnot in various Supreme Court decisions in the 70s and 80s. And then, of course, with Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, they just went all the way in, reducing blacks to a subservience that was little different from slavery.
You mentioned, of course, his memoirs. What are those like? Can one believe what he says? Is more of a polemic? Tell us about it.
You read them with a great deal of judiciousness. He published them at the end of his life, 1905, I think they came out, but he wrote them essentially in his 70s and 80s. Here again, he could be long-winded. He could be less than charitable to many of his colleagues from former days. He does tell some fascinating stories of the events that he was involved in. And also he, with many memoirs, he was in his 70s and 80s, and he at times just gets things wrong. He misremembers details from previous decades, so you do always have to double check what he's saying. On the other hand, it does reflect an incredible 60-year career that encompassed so many aspects of American life.
Yes.
Constitutional law and personal liberties, economics and finance, foreign policy, that it's a wonderful place to start, but you obviously then go on to do a lot of fact checking.
It's amazing how many times I've seen George Boutwell's name in my 53 years here at the shop, whether it's a Grant memoir or just historians mentioning Boutwell here and there, but never going into him. It's great that you've come by, and thanks, Professor Quarles, for getting you into this, even though he didn't know he was.
Yeah. If I can do quickly, another great stimulus to doing this book on George. A lot of your readers will be familiar with Nicholas Lehman's Redemption, the last battle of the Civil War.
Yes.
And he talks about that episode that you mentioned, the 1875-76 Senate committee that George headed and went down to Mississippi with to investigate the atrocities of white Southerners against blacks during the 1875 state elections. And when I read that book by Lehman, and I thought, my God, this guy it's the end of Reconstruction. Reconstruction is dying. Nobody cares anymore. They want to celebrate America's 100th birthday in 1876. And a lot of the folks who had been so pro-emancipation earlier just want to move away from protecting black rights, but not George Boutwell. He stands up on the floor of the Senate in August of 1876, just before Grant leaves office, still saying that we need to protect the basic rights of these fellow Americans.
Well, good for him. I mean, we needed that voice. We still
Yeah.
need that voice. So here is really a readable book. A
Yeah.
lot of great material in this, people. We're just giving you quick flashes so you know what's in here. But Jeffrey expands on all of them, and you'll get a background that we really don't usually get in other histories. So, Jeffrey, now that we're at our end, what would you like our readers to take away from this biography when they read it?
It's a story that's very much part and parcel of the greatness of Lincoln and Grant. That here is a person who, through a dint of hard work, self-education, and a commitment to the principles of representative government, equality of rights, equality of opportunity, really tried to put into practice the founding principles that America was founded on in 1776 at a very difficult time in the wake of the Civil War, and someone who devoted his life to that. And it's a lesson that, of course, we could take to heart today in terms of standing up for the principles of representative government that made America great.
Well, amen.
Yeah.
That's what I would say to that. Jeffrey, thank you so much. Enjoyed the book. I think all of you will also enjoy this book and should have it on your shelf for 19th century. And it has to sit right between the Lincoln shelf and the Grant shelf.
Grant shelf.
And so it should be right there. Thank you again, Jeffrey.
Great.
Appreciate it. And you've been watching A House Divided, and we'll do that very soon again.
Great. Thanks,
Bjorn, will you
Daniel.
take
Thanks,
us out?
Bjorn.